Here we're going to take a look at the way in which the English word forgiveness, or to forgive, is used to translate Hebrew words that have concepts that convey what in the English mind is sometimes thought of in terms of forgiveness. So, for instance, first of all, you see here that there are several different words, Hebrew words, that are often translated into English with this concept of forgiving. These words are nasa, which means to lift, to bear, to carry away, abad, to take away, maha, to blot out or to wipe out, and salah, to practice forbearance or to pardon. Particularly there is Numbers and Isaiah. Of the four, the last one, salah, is the most common, most frequent word that is translated with this idea of forgiving. So when we take a look at the meanings of these words, this idea of to lift, to bear, to take away, to blot out, to practice forbearance or to pardon, you get the idea of that what happens when God forgives. Usually that's what these terms are connected with, is the idea of God doing something with the sins or the transgressions of his people. He is lifting them. He's bearing them. He's carrying them away, taking away. He's blotting out, wiping away. He's forbearing with this with the iniquity in some way. And to pardon means then this idea of, okay, I recognize the transgression and sin, and that there's an obligation that comes with that sin or transgression, that there's some kind of punishment or consequence. And so to pardon means to, not to say you're not guilty, but to say that the obligation that is supposed to be carried out in connection with the transgression or the sin, that has been met, or that was no longer going to be required. And so when you're pardoned, it really has more the idea of not just that it's met, but that it's not going to be required of you. So a couple of things about forgiveness in the Hebrew Scriptures that is important to bear in mind. First, in the Hebrew Scriptures, it's always a sin or a transgression that can be forgiven. God doesn't forgive. There's no need to forgive anything if it is not a sin or a transgression. So you can't forgive a mistake if the mistake is not a sin. You don't forgive an error if the error is not a sin or a transgression. Another thing that's important is that it's only God who forgives sins in the Hebrew Scriptures. So only God does this. And so it's important to kind of bear in mind that since sin or transgression is understanding as a violation of God's law, then the obligation that a person who has sinned or transgression is an obligation to God. And therefore it requires God to act to the individual that they are no longer going to either suffer future consequences or future punishments, or are going to be held accountable to any obligations towards that sin. Now, although people do ask others to forgive, you see the word nasa, a sin, and here are a couple places in Genesis, Exodus, and 1 Samuel where this is done. The question is, what is meant when these people are asking others to forgive a sin? What does the individual want to happen? So, while there are those cases where a person is asked to forgive a sin, there is no text where an individual proclaims that they have forgiven another person's sin that's against them or against God. So in other words, we don't have in the Hebrew Scriptures someone declaring, I forgive you. So the question becomes then, when a person asks someone to forgive, what do they think is happening? And especially if forgiveness is something that is done towards a sin, and if it's a sin, then it's something that is done towards God. I think that in these cases that I've listed here, in the Genesis, Exodus, and 1 Samuel, what the person is asking when they ask someone to forgive a sin, they are asking for that individual to, in a sense, do something, since they are sometimes the one who has been wronged, to do something so that God will forgive them, so that God will not hold them accountable, or that God will not impose any further consequences for the sin or transgression that they have committed. So in other words, there's some obligation that they now have to God in suffering for their sin and transgression. They don't want to suffer anymore for that sin or transgression. Only God can make the decision that they don't suffer for that. But certain individuals play a role in getting to the point where God will no longer hold that person obligated to suffer consequences for their sin. So kind of keep this in mind. This is how forgiveness works in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's God who's going to forgive, but there are roles that people can play towards God doing that for an individual. And when a person is asked to forgive a sin, they are being asked to play their role in this process by which God will forgive the sin. So, last 2 points here is that divine forgiveness in the Hebrew Scriptures occurs under the condition or motivation of the person's heart. And that's usually indicated by that person confessing their sin, repenting, or sacrificing. So, that's the condition in which forgiveness is offered. Someone can become forgiven when they meet what God requires. That is, that they have confessed or recognized that they have done sin, or that they have a repentant heart, or that they make the appropriate sacrifices. So when those are done, then forgiveness can occur. Now, not everybody makes a sacrifice. Not everyone may actually make a confession, but these are the things that kind of understood kind of go with the process of receiving forgiveness. Acknowledging the sin, not wanting to commit that sin again, or indicating that the intent is not to commit a sin again, and in some cases then offering sacrifices. Divine forgiveness is also metaphorically described as this lifting the burden, the guilt of a person's sin, or cleansing the stain of a person's sin. So this metaphorically, forgiveness is seen as this lifting something, or the idea of cleansing, removing, in this case, a stain that a person has. So it sees sin as a burden, it sees sin as some kind of load on a person, or it sees sin as a stain, and the act that God does is to remove the burden or to remove the stain. And we oftentimes think about removing a stain as cleansing it. So this gives a kind of a brief little look at the way in which forgiveness operates within the Hebrew Scriptures or within the Old Testament.